Excellent. Thank you, Mr. President, and good evening, everyone. So, legacy. Legacy can mean many, many different things. It can be of, relating to, or being a previous or outdated computer system. Some of you may be familiar with that. It can refer to money or other personal property granted by the terms of a will. It can also mean that you are an author or illustrator whose books published in the United States have, over a period of years, a significant and lasting contribution to children's literature through books that demonstrate integrity and respect for all children's lives and experiences. That's my favorite one. That's my favorite definition. It's my favorite definition because that's the one that refers to Beverly Cleary, Virginia Hamilton, Lawrence Yep, Ashley Bryan, Tommy DePaola, Jerry Pinkney, Jacqueline Woodson, and 15 others throughout history. And tonight, together, we will add another name to this rich legacy of children's literature, Mr. Walter Dean Myers. Joining me in the joy of bestowing this honor are my fellow fantastic friends, colleagues, and ALSC members on the 2019 Children's Literature Legacy Award Committee. I'm proud to ask them to stand as I introduce them to you, and I am proud to ask all of you beautiful people in this sparkling ballroom to hold your applause until they're all standing and being recognized. My friends, please meet Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. Carol Arlene Edwards. Amy Kellman. And Dr. Cindy A. Lombardo, who is celebrating her 45th wedding anniversary tonight with her husband, not with us. She's not here, but she is here in spirit. So please, the committee. As a young man who found solace in books, Walter Dean Myers grew up to draw on his vast literary talent and deep empathy for young readers to create shelves full of books over the course of a half-century-long career that were groundbreaking, they were distinctive, and they are vital. A Newbery honoree, recipient of multiple Coretta Scott King Book Awards, Hans Christian Andersen Award nominee, National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, and, most importantly, a kind, funny, and passionate human being. Walter Dean Myers exemplified excellence in many written forms, including biography, fiction, history, and poetry, and his books bring profound insight to his vivid portrayals of Black culture and Black lives, especially those of boys and young men, capturing their language and concerns, struggles, and successes. With a particular brilliance for humor and curiosity, his work reminds readers, without preaching, that they always have choices. Well, except for one, because as Mr. Myers would surely remind us all here tonight, reading is not optional. Say it with me, please. Reading is not optional. Before he passed in 2014, Mr. Myers lived for many years in New Jersey, often creating books collaboratively with his son, Christopher Myers, whom we're so honored is here with us this evening. And so, Christopher, please come and accept the 2019 Children's Literature Legacy Award on behalf of your father, Walter Dean Myers.
Dear Dad. Nah, I wouldn't have ever started it that way. Hey, Pop. It's been a minute since I've written you a proper letter, mostly because I don't know your address or even if they have email wherever you are. When you were around, we'd write each other lots of letters, even if we knew we'd be meeting up for breakfast the next day. It's still nice to go through my inbox and see things you wrote me from years ago. I miss this way of talking to you. I'm writing to tell you that you won the Legacy Award, which is to say you've changed the game, which I guess you already knew, but it's nice to hear people say it. I wish you were here to give this speech, if only to hear you do the thing where you talk about getting the call. When I got the news, it was early in the morning around cloud 7. I was with Chinua Achebe, Rabindranath Tagore, Gabriela Mistral, Lee Poe, and Langston Hughes having breakfast, talking about how much work you could get a verb to do in a sentence. When St. Peter said, "Hey, Walter, you got a phone call from Earth. I hear a lot of people giggling on the other side." And I said, "Man, do we have a phone up here? Who found out the number?" To which St. Peter replied, "I think it's librarians. They're good with information." People have said so many things about you in the past 5 years. They put up a plaque at the George Bruce Branch Library on 125th Street. Go on. Where you used to spend hours and hours as a kid. I imagine telling kid you that they would have a plaque up with your name, Harlem Bad Boy, done good. They named a bunch of things after you. There were some grants and some reading rooms. There's even an award called the Walter, which my friend Jason, remember him, has won now like 53 times. People sort of invoke you whenever they want to say that they're doing something important or real, or if they want to say that they're caring for Black children or young people of color or poor kids or boys or whoever they want to say that they're caring for. I've heard so many stories of significant things you said to various folks. You'd be surprised how many significant things you'd said. They all talk about your voice being deep and that you were tall. Lots of folks say, "You know how Walter was." Like, Walter Dean Myers was in the elevator. He loomed above me and looked down at me with his warm brown eyes and said in that voice of his, "You know how Walter was." Then everyone in the audience half laughs and half sighs. Then they follow up with some deep affecting thing you said, a pearl of wisdom, at which point there's a smattering of applause and general agreement. Once I began to read, I began to exist. Nobody ever quotes the silly stuff. When a baby is born, this is a quote, when a baby is born, you shouldn't say discouraging things about it like, "Hey, I seen prettier dogs than that baby." Which is probably for the best, though you are still funny and still make me laugh. All this quoting and remembering the stories, the significant moments in elevators and classrooms and juvenile detention centers. They'll quote you on tote bags and bookmarks at the beginning of their essays and then at the end of their speeches. It's their way of claiming you, and it's beautiful. Sometimes the you they claim is unfamiliar to me, like a cardboard cutout of what they think a writer is. Some sort of Moses come down from the mountain with stone tablets that lay down commandments about young people, literature, and how to change our literary landscape to better reflect the people around us. James Earl Jones' voice, stentorian tones, wisdom and vocabularies crowded with gravitas. It's still a part of you, and I'm thankful for it, even when I don't agree or know you wouldn't agree, but it's not you. People write and rewrite you. I saw somewhere where they said that your gift is that you wrote with an authentic urban voice, that you kept up on all the latest slang. And I wonder, what books were they reading? I remember a few times reading a manuscript and suggesting maybe you drop Jim from some character's speech, as in, "What's happening, Jim?" Unless that character was born in the 1930s and hit his stride in the 1960s in New York like you. The people who write such things, I imagine them imagining you. Walking around Harlem or Jersey City on a summer day, scribbling into your anthro-linguistic notepad, "The youths are saying the word Gucci for good. I must include this in my next novel." I even hear other writers touting their own downness. "I listen to hip hop. That's my music, man. That's how I stay relating to the kids." And I wish you could magically appear and whisper a little advice in their ears. Write them a letter. I wish I could give them my memories sometimes. You listening to Cesaria Evora or Dulce Pontes as she twists a mournful fado from the little radio behind your desk. You are laughing at a funny thing you wrote in that way that you enjoyed writing for its own sake. You are looking up at the collage Mama made for whatever your latest project was, yelling at the cat to stop giving you the evil eye as you typed. Another person once said to me, "Your father was real. He wasn't afraid to tell the truth about the hood, no matter how harsh." And I never really know what they mean. I smile, I say thanks. I can't imagine a faux you as opposed to the real one that they imagine. I see a fair number of books published that try to do that thing, of being a particular version of real, sort of sadness competitions. These books depict young people who see themselves more through the eyes of others than their own eyes, a race to abjection, as if poverty or oppression was a thief that could rob you of humor, love, family, and everything else you held dear. These are books that speak to what other people imagine it's like to be black or poor or whatever else we are, refugees or queer or any number of things to which society doesn't show love. And sincerely, I think for them, if they were to wake up in Harlem in 1947 and be 10 years old and poor and confused about what exactly they were supposed to dream of being, because on one hand, they were told they were intelligent and good writers, and on the other hand, they saw the glass ceilings of race and class slicing through what their dreams could have been. If those people had to imagine being you, it might just be sadness. They wouldn't have sisters or comic books and parents that loved them through the struggle and dime store candy and roller skates. I smell somewhere in all that writing, reading, and publishing the books that reduce our lives to suffering, a hunger for our pain. I remember when you went to that school somewhere out west. This was in the 80s. And Dad would go out to schools and then come back and tell me everything that happened. And the teachers were doing an exercise in which they were talking to a grade school class about slavery. They made all the kids lie on the floor, packed tightly together. Then they shut off the lights, and they said, "Now imagine you've all been kidnapped from home, and you'll never see your families again." And the little white kids who maybe hadn't seen any black people before began to cry. And when those kids grow up, they will hopefully have sympathetic hearts and they will imagine the African American experience as a horror story and read books that confirm their ideas about what it is to be you or me or us. You told me that afternoon they got up to ask you questions, and one little boy, still tearful from his ordeal, raised his little hand and asked in the tenderest, most sympathetic voice, "Were you a slave?" I imagine the books written in your name telling the harsh truths are created by people like those, or even people like us who got the message that the only thing important about our stories is our pain. Well-meaning, but maybe missing the point. To tell the truth, Pop, there's a whole slew of people missing points. There are people busy condemning books they haven't read, and people trying to regulate who is allowed to write what. I remember how many thin years we had when you were trying to write almost anything to put food on our table, and those agents and editors, not you, Miriam, who thought themselves clever to say that you should write something urban because it had been successful before. And besides, what did you know about the Arctic, which you had been stationed in the Army, or the flute, which you played almost every morning, or Tariq ibn Ziyad, the African Muslim who conquered Spain in the year 711? Shouldn't we leave those books to be written by 8th century representatives of the Caliphate? Thank goodness for Mom, who was always your harshest reader and ardent supporter, who said things like, "Well, I don't think the main character is likable," or very occasionally, "This one is just good." You always said there's a special love in someone who will be honest with you about your work. Your mother loves me like that. And as I continue making things in the world, I see how rare it is. Think about the editors you swore by, like Phoebe and Regina. And Pop, don't get me started on Twitter. You'd be amazed at the amount of people that think they can say something nuanced and important and worth the time it takes to type it in 280 characters. I don't think they love language the way you taught me to. At least most of them don't. But all of them, the ones that get it and the ones that don't, they appreciate and claim you. They say nice things about you. They talk about what you've done and how it makes what they want to do possible. And in between all the missed points, there is something there, some common thread. It's easy to identify what it isn't, but just the way that your hands flashed through the air when you spoke, as if doing an interpretive dance of whatever speech you were giving, I want to capture the thread of what it is, too. Last week, I was in the maximum security facility for girls in upstate New York. It's where they've moved all the hard cases since they shut down Spofford and the juvenile detention facilities you and I went to when I first started making books. I still go to those prisons, make it my business to be there. It's strange the times when I feel you with me. Every time, for example, when I enter a juvenile detention center. I must have been 20 or 21 when we first went to one together, not much older than the inmates. It's still scary, the layers of chain link cutting into the sky, the barbed wire, the clank and buzz of electric gates, the list of contraband, no sharp pencils, no hard candies, no paper clips, no phones. It's still as much of a shock when the inmate children shuffle out from their rooms to whichever auditorium, drab classroom, or gym we are about to do a presentation in, their brightly colored jumpsuits slouching off their teenage shoulders, laceless shoes barely hanging onto their feet, awkward as puberty or children in jail. How can their clothes fit them when their limbs don't? In every jail I have ever visited, your name is the passport, the thing that gives me street cred, I worked on Monster with my father, Walter Dean Myers, and even in the most sparse prison libraries, there are a few tattered copies of Monster. I began talking with the girls about stories, about the idea that we are bounded by the stories that have been told about us. This, for them, is a truth they recognize, learned as much in courtrooms and police stations as in school libraries. This is the truth you taught me. From time to time, people ask how I relate to young people in such desperate circumstances. They are most often abused, hurting, and scared. They are as responsible for their current situation as any 11, 12, or 13-year-old is, which is to say, not very. People who don't visit kid prisons wonder if I adjust my language or attitude, if I stay up on the latest lingo. I remember the countless times that we were in these places together and laugh at the thought of you slanging it up for some young folks. You always told them what you thought was true, and that, especially for these young folks, is always passport enough. They tell me the stories they feel have risen around them, that cut into their skies, like the barbed wire and chain link fences. And I think of you again, a boy in Harlem, who looked at the stories that limited you, what cut into your sky. I remember how you saw yourself in these girls, in the boys on the news that were arrested, on trial, or dying. They're still turning us into hashtags, Pop. We would leave every jail and you would shake your head. I think we got to them. I hope I wasn't too late. And I would tell you, Dad, it's not your fault. And every time you'd ask, isn't it? You talked often about getting to them. My father's work, your work, was more than anything about being responsible. You felt that so much was your fault because you believed so much that books changed the world, changed people's lives, as your life was changed by books. And as we look at each of the books that they honor every year, I want them to ask what you asked. How will this book change the world, change the life of a child? Whose worlds are we referring to? What are the worlds that we are bringing into being? We're still having the same conversations now. 5 years since you left. Jackie, Jason, Phoebe, Meg, Kwame, Namrata, Juji, the publishers, the librarians, the people who know how important stories are. Seems like the whole world now is caught up, worried about getting to them and all the various thems that you wouldn't have imagined, but would have worried about all the same. Remember a few years ago, that village I went to in Papua New Guinea? I wish I could have talked to you about that whole experience. There was one day I felt you with me so strongly. Papua New Guinea is made of thousands of tiny little islands. Each one of them has its own language, culture, customs. The people there are black, but black from before. Where we came to the U.S. from the continent within the last couple hundred years, they say their migration from Africa was made over 30,000 years ago. But they still listen to reggae, dancehall, hip-hop, and soul. They look at us as least sort of like cousins. The barbers know what I mean when I walk in and say, give me a 00. Anybody? All right. Wrong room. There was one island about the size of Central Park, surrounded by endless crystal water, dotted with thatched huts teetering on bamboo poles. There was no electricity, save for the D batteries in the one portable radio tuned to the local radio station broadcasting from Alatau, the nearest island city, which was maybe still several days boat ride away. There was one school on the island, a fragile building made of corrugated tin and scraps of linoleum instead of dried grass, with a smattering of outdated books, colonial holdovers, the occasional tow-headed, ruddy-cheeked Dicks or Janes. Otherwise, the tiny island in the clear water was almost devoid of pictures. There were no mirrors. There were 2 photos pinned to the side of one thatched hut of someone's grandfather who had ventured off the island and played soccer. A faded silkscreen of Bob Marley stared out from a hand-me-down t-shirt, probably distributed by an NGO. And I thought of how many times I'd written the words image famine when referring to the op-eds we'd written in the New York Times. My first instinct was to draw every kid there, and I asked them all to stand in a line and watercolors splashing about in a plastic tub of seawater. I did my best. The line became a crowd of brown little ones, their mothers and fathers, extended families. The sun was setting. I wanted to draw the grandparents too. A little boy described to me a friend he'd lost. It was all too much, and so I turned to you. When I travel, I carry my watercolors, but also I carry books, because children's books are a valuable commodity all over the world. And I pulled out a copy of Blues Journey, and they looked at the pictures, the brown faces I'd painted in blue ink, and together we sang your blues lyrics. I was standing at the crossroads, didn't know which way to go. Standing out the crossroads, didn't know which way to go. My heart was pulling one way, my head said, take it slow. And for a moment, you were there with me. Those parents and their children, 1,000 million miles from Harlem, from New York, from anywhere you would have ever been, your words were being a mirror for the entirety of an island. And even though I was far away and you'd been gone from the earth, there you were, getting to them, sharing your blues, your laughter, your songs, your words. Getting to them and me and us and getting through to us never meant speaking the exact same language or a hobby-like fascination with pain and hardship. It means being vulnerable and honest and giving that vulnerability as a gift. It means caring more for the story that you were telling, for the young people and communities reading that story, than for what that story represents, or someone else's poor imagination of what our lives ought to be. I know how tired you were of books whose main purpose seemed to be supplementing or correcting other people's poor imaginations of us, proving and reproving what we were prepared to take as our ground, that we were already good people, worthy of celebration and mythology. So much more loving and fun to expand instead on our rich imaginations of ourselves, less proving and more building. It means truly believing in the power of words, in the art, in the writing as giving a little piece of yourself. You told us about young people like you were, ambitious and fearful, guarded and loving, intimidated and brave, mixed up and beautiful. You told me that the reward of a story was in the growth of a character. The journey was the thing. No one cared about superheroes unless they had a weakness, a vulnerability that was a strength. That is what every child in classrooms and prisons, riding subways, or walking through cornfields recognizes in these books you'd written, and themselves. Kids that have been painted with masks like thug, or good for nothing, threat, or fear. First, you saw in them yourself, and then articulated all that vulnerability, lightness, sweetness, and love. Papa, you gave us so many pieces of yourself, keys, a way of rendering other people visible. Your generosity allowed you to cross the fences and barbed wires of the poorest imaginations, the ones who look at children in cages at the borders, or homeless, or solidly middle-class kids with that quiet desperation of never being seen, all the marginalized children in danger of being swallowed by the stories that threaten to erase them, all the fragments that people remember to me of you that are all true in their way, just the way every young person is really a set of possibilities, a group of futures. You saw all of these kids and wrote lifelines, stories for them all. Back in the correctional facility for teenage girls, I asked the inmates, strange to call babies such an impersonal word, to tell me a story of themselves 10 years in the future when they are 23 or 25. One whose smile for a moment breaks through the layers of gray paint and cinder block, looks at me sideways. I don't know if I'm gonna be here then. I think of you again, what you would have told her, what you do, how necessary it is. You are a storyteller, which is another word for magic. You made stories that resurrected babies who imagined themselves nowhere in 5 years. You make stories that give those children a possibility of tomorrow, Papa. I think more than any one book, any poetic turn of phrase, and you had many, or heartbreaking saga, I think that this is your legacy. All the young people who couldn't imagine themselves and the imaginations that you let loose, they are standing in an endless line like those children in Papua New Guinea waiting to be drawn. And they will read your books and see themselves in vulnerabilities of the characters, in the humor, in your artistry, in the magic that happens between the words that invites every reader to be a part of the story. You made a space for them, and you couldn't anticipate where they would go. Jackie and Linda Sue are institutions. Jason is pumping out stories until his heart bursts, like some sort of literary John Henry. I wish you could have met Akweke. You would have said it's unfair for someone to be that charming and that good of a writer. We're all trying to keep up the good work, Papa. You'd be excited by so much of what's happening. Tomorrows that you wrote into being. Stories that you started long ago and hopefully won't end. I remember once it was in Brooklyn. We went to a high school, and a kid looked at you and said, "So you supposed to be a famous writer?" And you said something like, "Well, I'm kind of well known." And then he said, "But you look like an old dude from my block, like a regular person." We went for a walk after that, through one of those parts of Red Hook, made of fences and brick towers, the kind of place we feel at home. And you smiled and you said, "I think I got through to that one." Meaning that maybe he got the key that took you from the George Bruce Branch Library on 125th Street through hundreds of books and poems of stories, that maybe he understood that yes, we are bounded by the stories that are told about us, but we too can write our own stories. And in that sense of giving someone a tomorrow, you said, "I think I did good." Dad, I think you did good too. We all do. Love, Chris.